You are listening to Russia on the Record, a podcast from the Moscow Times. This week, we're going to look at how the attack on Crocus City Hall has caused a spike in xenophobia in Russia. According to the latest data we have, the death toll currently stands at 145, including 6 children. A further 551 people are injured, according to officials. 11 people have been arrested in connection with the attack, including 4 suspected gunmen. It emerged soon after the attack that US intelligence had warned Russia about a possible major terrorist incident, which Russia has confirmed. However, Sergei Naryshkin, head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, said that the information they received was too vague for the Russian security services to take action. Despite the Islamic State in Khorasan province taking responsibility for the attack, several Russian lawmakers have asserted, without evidence, that Ukraine and the West are partly responsible. But before we get further into discussing that subject, here's a roundup of what else has been going on in Russia this week. Ukrainian drones have struck 2 industrial sites in the Republic of Tatarstan, over 1,000 kilometers from the Russian-Ukrainian border, in the furthest reaching cross-border attack so far in the war. Kiev says the strike targeted factories where Iranian-designed Shahed drones are assembled by students of a technical college. These drones have proved to be a cheap and effective way for Russia to target Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure. Russia's defense ministry said it had recruited 100,000 contract soldiers so far this year. Ukraine's President Zelensky, meanwhile, signed a bill to lower the age of conscription from 27 to 25 in order to free up more manpower. Analysts have cited a shortage of soldiers as one of the biggest challenges facing Ukraine as the war continues. According to a joint investigation from The Insider, 60 Minutes, and Der Spiegel, the condition known as Havana syndrome, where American spies, diplomats, and military officers abroad have fallen ill and reported hearing piercing sounds at night, may have been caused by sonic weaponry allegedly used by Russian military intelligence. US intelligence has previously said that it was very unlikely that there was any foreign involvement behind Havana syndrome, whose symptoms can include dizziness, brain fog, and depression. Other suggested causes include pre-existing conditions and environmental factors. Fears are growing about the condition of veteran rights activist Oleg Orlov, who was imprisoned last month for 2.5 years for discrediting the Russian military. Memorial, the organization he co-founded, said this week his hearing was starting to fail. Orlov was offered the opportunity by prison authorities to fight in Ukraine instead of serving his sentence. The activist is 70 years old. And 2 independent journalists are being held on extremism charges in connection with the late opposition politician Alexei Navalny. SOTA Vision reporter Antonia Favorskaya reported extensively on Navalny's work and his funeral. Novaya Gazeta reported, citing anonymous sources, that she is accused of working for Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, which Russia has declared to be an undesirable organization. Favorskaya told journalists that her detention was linked to her article about Navalny's torture in prison. Also, Rus News reporter Olga Komlova, who had previously volunteered for Navalny's campaign office in the city of Ufa, was detained on similar charges. Since the suspected gunmen in the Crocus City Hall attack were identified as being Tajik citizens, xenophobia has soared in Russia. In Moscow, police established special units to carry out document checks on motorways and in hostels. There were even police raids targeting migrants in major Russian cities. This rise in migrant-phobia and xenophobia has caused a lot of concern from different NGOs and activists. We asked Alexander Verkhovsky, head of the Sova Center think tank, which researches nationalism and racism in Russia, about the dangerous rise in these sentiments.
It was impossible not to notice the sharp increase in anti-migrant rhetoric at all levels, from members of the government to petty nationalist activists. There is probably a change in the mood of the general public, as far as one can judge from individual incidents, but no one has published any quantitative data on this topic yet, and I am not even sure they will. Finally, we can pay attention to incidents of racist violence, which is monitored by our center. Here we see a sharper increase in the week after the terrorist attack, but only a few attacks are known to have been carried out as revenge for their terrorist attack. We see also the overall increase in March compared to February, and the last week of March is a vacation time for many schools, and given the age of the typical attacker, vacation time is always an additional risk factor. Migrant-phobia in Russia is precisely a racist phenomenon. No one would call a visitor with a French passport a migrant. Even Ukrainian or Moldovan passports and surnames are only partially covered by this word. Basically, we are talking about people from Central Asia, the Caucasus, and partly from other Asian countries, but necessarily those who do not look like Slavs. So a migrant is accessed by phenotype, not by documents. So a Tajik with a Russian passport is still usually perceived as a migrant, but so is a Yakut or Buryat.
We also asked Verkhovsky about the possible reasons for the rise in xenophobia and what the consequences could be.
The state, of course, prosecutes violent hate crimes. Another thing is that it has been doing a poor job of it since last year, as the number of such crimes rose sharply last year, surpassing the previous 8 years already. While the groups and figures which do not beat or stop but incite hatred are now generally unpunished, they look more like a radical wing of the official ideology, and law enforcement agencies simply do not have enough resources to follow them. And after the terrorist attack in Crocus, it is also unclear what course the Kremlin will choose in the migrant issue. On the one hand, there is a temptation to put pressure on them for populist reasons. On the other hand, it is impossible to allow a significant outflow of migrants for economic reasons. The topic of migration is very important in Russian society, but there has not been and is not a stable official line on it. It is unlikely that there will be.
Free Buryatia is an advocacy group that focuses on minority rights in the Russian Republic of Buryatia, located east of Lake Baikal in Siberia. We talked to one of the group's founders, Vika Maladaeva, who is also president of the Indigenous of Russia Foundation, about Russia's problems with xenophobia and her own experience as a member of one of the country's many ethnic minority communities. Are migrant-phobia and xenophobia major problems for Russian society today? And how do migrants become integrated within Russian society?
Yes, migrant-phobia, xenophobia, and racism, these virulent abscess of Russian society that people have been turning the blind eye to for years, considering them insignificant. But they affect the lives of millions of people in Russia and abroad, because those who speak out about racism and who live outside of Russia often face the same racist attack. It's systemic racism, because in Russia there is a discriminatory law on registration, which only affects individuals of non-Slavic appearance. And it's under this law that non-ethnic Russians are stopped and searched in the metro and other public places. Even if you have Russian passports, but you don't have the papers, you can get detained, like my mother did when we lived in Russia. She spent about 5 years and she was detained basically for 5 hours because she forgot her passport and police didn't believe that she's a Russian citizen. So how migrants integrate in Russian society? Well, nowadays, I think it's very hard for them. Their kids go to school, they work in Russia, but it's very hard for them to integrate because of the migrant-phobia and the Islamophobia after the attack on Crocus City Hall. And Russian authorities right now, along with so-called people's brigades, constantly conduct raids, and even independent media always mention nationality when discussing or like telling about the crimes. But when the good things happens, nationality is often overlooked, and this is also part of the problem.
You mentioned this special legislation. Does it apply to all Russian citizens? So both Russian and foreign citizens would need to register if they were staying somewhere for a certain amount of time, but in practice this law is only applied to people who don't look Slavic?
When I lived in St. Petersburg, we would have to always carry a Russian passport, which is like the most important document. And if you lose it, then it will take, months to get a new passport. So, but you have to do it because otherwise you could be stopped and searched, especially men's. You could be stopped, searched, and detained. And not to mention rent, landlords only rent the apartments to ethnic Russian. If you go to Avito, most popular website to find a place to live, there's thousands of messages with only for Slavic people.
So we're not only talking about migrant-phobia, but also discrimination against Russians who don't look Slavic.
Yeah, because in Russia, they don't stop, search, judge you by beat you or attack you by passport. You're being attacked by your appearance if you're non-Slavic. And it's very hard to, say who is Kyrgyz, who is Buryat. For example, I have Kyrgyz friends and we look alike and you wouldn't even tell the difference, if she's Buryat or Kyrgyz, or Kalmyk or Tajik and Tatar and so on. So they could attack anyone, Muslims who wear hijabs. And in Russia, there's over 20 million Muslims live, many of whom indigenous people of Russia, and they've been attacked. For example, I just saw on Instagram story, a friend of mine posted about her friend in Moscow. She wanted to rent an apartment and she called, but she has not Russian first and last name and they just turned her down. And she is Bashkort, so indigenous person. So they judge you by appearance, by your first and last name. That's why I have name Victoria, so I can pass at least by Victoria. And a lot of ethnic indigenous people has Russian names for that case, especially because when you apply for work, they would look at your resume, right? And they see some non-Russian name and they could just basically discriminate just based on that without even seeing you or talking to you. Many people in Russia also being discriminated in such places like university, for example. My colleague, anti-war activist Maria Vyushkova, told once a story about her colleague who is a scientist from Novosibirsk, and he did not go to Moscow to defend his dissertation precisely because he was fearing for his life. At that time, there was a rise of Russian nationalists and Ruski Marshi, etc. Kids after school, they don't go to the best Western universities in Russia also because of this. And all of this has a significant impact on both personally and on individuals and in terms of national republics.
Do you think that this widespread xenophobia is encouraged by the Russian authorities? And do you think this is a legacy of Russia's colonial heritage, as we see in other countries with similar pasts?
I mentioned earlier about the raids. So police basically collaborate with this People's Brigade, which are basically Russian Nazis. It's a young group of people who join police force and they do these raids, go to markets and go to places where migrants work or live, and they check their papers. They could beat them because in their mind, migrants are not people and they don't have any rights to be and work in Russia. And it's the message that we see from Russian government is, well, in the law, in Russian constitution, ethnic Russians considered as state-forming nations, and it is discriminatory towards other ethnicities because Russia is very diverse and there's more than 190 nationalities, and we all should have same human rights and we are all equal, but it's not what Russian government promotes. Of course, it's all has a deep roots on imperial mindset and imperial tactics of Russian Federation during Russian imperial time. So indigenous people were officially called on papers as inarodsi, which is, I don't know if there is a word in English, but it's basically like outsiders. In Soviet era, we were called neruski, which is like non-ethnic Russian, and just a lot of things like Buryat people, for example, in Soviet era were called nalim. It's a fish that has this narrow eyes, and people would call Buryat like that. I had no idea that it was racism was back then. So yeah, it is tied to imperial mindset.
You're a decolonial activist. Do activists like yourself do outreach or advocacy work with migrants in Russia as well as indigenous minorities?
I think this question is framed incorrectly a bit because opposition figures who have influence, resources, and connections with European or American politicians should be the one primarily addressing this issue. Decolonial activists don't have these resources, no connections. Oftentimes, we do what we can. We're not even invited to all these numerous conferences, like anti-war conferences, meeting of the Russian opposition. And it's like we are invisible for many of them. And that's also a part of the problem. Recently, ethnic organizations and activists wrote an open letter regarding xenophobia and racism in Russia. But as usual, independent Russian media ignored it. Activists in Berlin will be protesting, I believe, this Saturday in front of Russian embassy. And we've been talking about racism in Russia for a long time, especially in the last 2 years. You can find numerous interviews with decolonial and ethnic activists on this topic in major global media outlets. We write about it on social media, in our organizations, but we constantly encounter hate, gaslighting, and just devaluation of our experiences.
What short and long-term solutions do you see to fight against migrant-phobia and xenophobia in Russia?
Great question. Thank you. For the short solution, listen and pay attention to ethnic activists on this topic, provide funding, donations for the projects. Most ethnic organizations exist without any funding. Stop using xenophobic language, including words like separatists and nationalists. And condemn any xenophobic statements in your circle, public spaces and online, hold people accountable, conduct large-scale media campaigns, educate children and your circle about tolerance and equal rights. For the long-term solution, I think we should have a mandatory tolerance classes from kindergarten and school, workshops and lectures in universities and in any workspace. In the US, for example, every employee must undergo a lecture it is a mandatory requirement when starting a new job on equality. It's about like racism and sexism and such. We also need a proper representation in cinema, TV, media, and art, specifically for indigenous people of Russia, because non-Russian actors typically portray roles of alcoholics or like unintelligent individuals. Moreover, representations in Russia often only includes representatives from post-Soviet countries to showcase supposed internationalists, but they are not indigenous people. We need documentaries about racism, movies, art, and we need our own radio, TV, media outlets. It is also necessary for indigenous people to be represented from the bottom to leadership positions in companies, including media outlets. I think this is the path to a more inclusive society.
That's all for this episode. We'll continue to keep you up to date on the latest news from Russia, including the consequences of this attack, in future episodes and on the Moscow Times website. Be sure to follow us on social media and join us next week. And thank you for listening to Russia on the Record.